We continue our discussion of the notion of invisible hand. In The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith introduces this term once again, and he says invisible hand can be understood as a kind of unintended consequences thing. And this is a very interesting and also novel idea. So for this reason, we can say that Adam Smith is not only the founder of economics, but also of social science in general, methodologically speaking, of course. Because social reproduction and even the whole question of the emergence of order was answered in a satisfactory way by Adam Smith in this idea, but still we should be careful about these kinds of interpretations because there's this guy, what was his name? William Grant. He says Adam Smith was not clear, actually, in this particular sentence or in this particular passage. And he wrote an article in 2002, I guess, I'm not sure. What did Smith mean by the invisible hand? He can say at least there are 8 different interpretations is possible on the basis of this passage. And also he introduces an nth one, his own interpretation, but still usually our own understanding as economists, of course, understanding of the notion of invisible hand is something like this. This was taken from Dixit and Nailgoff's famous book on game theory, actually. That's quite an interesting book. And it says basically it's about paying the price for each factor of production or resource, as we always talk about in economics. Economics is about resource allocation. Resources are scarce, so allocation is the basic problem that necessitates choice, and these choices must be rational, etc., etc. So basically, this is one of the best explanations of how, economically speaking, of course, this notion can be understood. When I buy a certain good, it means that I use some resource, labor capital land, that has a social value. The only thing that keeps me from overusing this resource is its price, because I'd be willing to pay this price only if the value of this good for me is greater than this price. Since in a market in which competition works efficiently, the price will be equal to the cost of production. That is to be defined to include profit as well of the good in question. This means that I would be willing to consume that good only if its value to me is greater than, or at least equal to its social value. In other words, the market mechanism ensures that I will consume that good only in necessary amount, because the price I will pay for this good will be exactly equal to the social total cost of the resources that are used in the production of that good. This is the purely economic interpretation of the idea of invisible hand, as was understood and is understood by the liberal economists in general. So according to this story, when every individual acts rationally, profit maximization, utility maximization, maximizing something and minimizing something, in other words, constrained optimization, the outcome will be social rationality. Resources will be utilized and allocated in such a way that everybody will be happy. And there is no waste of resources. This is achieved by the system's attainment of equilibrium. The state of equilibrium is a state in which individuals' benefits and gains are maximized and the optimal plans of buyers and sellers are in complete harmony. The consistency of optimal plans of households and firms, according to the Austrian definition of equilibrium. So this is the idea. But even we can say that there's a broader significance of this notion of invisible hand, which is, as I said before, the notion of order as understood by the outcomes, unintended outcome of intentional individual behavior. It's the idea of emergence, so to speak. The social order emerges on the basis of individual actions, which are intentional by nature, but which have also some unintended, unplanned consequences. And these consequences means the emergence of a social order that is efficient in the Pareto sense, maybe, or in different senses. And also it's an optimal order, which everybody is happy as compared to other possible states. In other words, again, it's a kind of Panglossian type of understanding. You know, this order is the best of all possible ones. This word is the best of all possible words. Remember our discussion of Pangloss, Dr. Pangloss. So, but William Graham thinks other ways. He says there are a number of different interpretations, nine different ones. And I will place this on the Google Classroom so you can read it if you are interested in. And there's also his own interpretation. This is a very interesting article. If I can also place it, I guess, a copy of this article, so I should recommend you to read it. Anyway, in this broader sense, as a social theoretic approach to the emergence of order, and we can say that the invisible hand not only maintains that in market economies the coordination between different decision-making agents is spontaneously established without any need for another authority, but also it argues that this harmony can generate a sustainable and stable social and economic order, even though not intended or desired by anybody. So for this reason, we can say that Adam Smith can be considered as a founder of social theory and also economics, of course, right? That's why he's an important fellow. So basically, it is not possible to say that since Smith, the answer to the question of what ensures social cohesion and order in modern societies has changed, which is the idea of unintended consequences of intentional human action. Well, there's this allegory by Scott Gordon, devised by Scott Gordon, and about the emergence of order or the creation or establishment of some kind of social order. And he distinguishes among three types of order. One is the Leibnizian idea or Newtonian mechanistic idea of order, pre-established harmony, which is the notion of Leibniz's. And he gives as an example, he gives the example of an orchestra consisting of many musicians. In the first pre-established harmony type of order, the orchestra musicians are very familiar with relevant pieces of music. Therefore, they perform in harmony. Remember, in Leibniz, God created the perfect order, pre-established harmony. So every piece, every single atom or monad must behave accordingly to reproduce this pre-established and perfect harmony. This is one understanding of this. It's purely a mechanistic understanding of order. It is based upon, loosely at least, the idea of functionalism, maybe. There's this order, the market system, for example. Market system will create the best, the most efficient outcomes spontaneously without any kind of outside intervention, etc. If there will be any intervention, the order itself will be destroyed, even, you can say. The second type of order is the centrally established harmony. Harmony among musicians can be established by the conductor who knows the piece of music very well and who can change it from time to time, which can be seen as a kind of Hobbesian order. Remember Thomas Hobbes' idea of social contract? Hobbes starts with the famous dictum that individuals are self-interested behavior. So he fears that if they are left to their own devices, there will be chaos and anarchy in the society because each of us will try to achieve what we want to achieve, and by all means necessary, including violence and wars, etc., etc. So, in other words, human beings are a wolf to another homo homini lupus idea. There's only one way of establishing this order, which is the existence of the state or tyrant, even, right? Not necessarily the king or the state. And this state was to be established through a social contract. It's a fictional example, actually, not a historical one, we can say. And this social contract gives, through this social contract, individuals will transfer their rights and freedoms to state in return of the creation of social order and harmony. So, and centrally, established harmony is required. This is maybe the beginning of the economic science in general in the 16th century. Remember, 16th to 17th century, this is the process of the establishment of economics in general, or political economy, basically. Economics, the basic question of economics is more or less still the same. If individuals or human beings in general are rational beings, which uses any means under their command to achieve their own ends or aims, then why don't we have any kind of chaos? The answers to this question may differ. Hobbes says there's a central authority which prevents chaos from happening because of the force and even violence exerted by the central authority, which is the state itself. Another idea is Adam Smith's idea. Even before Adam Smith, Bernard de Monday uses the same example in the context of a poem, long poem actually, the Parable of the Bees idea. But scientifically speaking, you can say that the idea of spontaneous order or invisible hand first introduced by Adam Smith. In this idea, again, to follow this same allegory, musicians have harmony by using knowledge which they acquire by listening to the sound of instruments played by other musicians. The third example rather recalls a musical group without a conductor that makes improvised music, in the jazz music, for example. This is very common, right? There was this famous group, what was that? Modern Jazz Quartet. I don't know if you are familiar with that, which was very good, maybe, which is very good. Anyway, that's another idea. But invisible hand idea is exactly similar to this. There are different players, different musicians, and they act according to the others' actions, etc. So there will be some interactions. These interactions is nothing but the characterizing the social order or economic order, which is market state. And so the emergence of market system will create efficient allocation and also individual freedom. Everyone is happy and everyone will act on the basis of their self-interest. And also a stable social order will emerge without any kind of plan or any kind of outside intervention by the state, for example, or any kind of outside authority. That's the basic thing. So in economics, this is a very good explanation. It's also establishes a very strong defense of the market mechanism. And for this reason, it is very attractive. It has been very attractive through ages. for the liberals in general, or most of the economists. Well, most of the economists are liberals. That's another idea. So there are some basic rules in this creation of invisible hand as a social mechanism, or the mechanism of order. According to Ullman Margalit, individual invisible hand, should have some mechanism too, particularly. One is a filtering mechanism, which keeps out all beings, impacts, or processes that might ruin the achievable pattern. You know, one of the most important or frequent criticism of the idea of invisible hand is the existence of idiosyncrasies among individuals. What I mean is that in usual general equilibrium models, we use the representative individual thing, you know, it's the atom, which is the very basis of the system, and this atom, they are all the same. It's representative, all individuals are similar, they are self-interested, there are no differences of, I don't know, for example, race, gender, class, etc., etc. But the existence of these kind of differences may disrupt the working of the mechanism or its reproduction in general. So according to this first rule, such noises, so to speak, or disturbances should not affect the working of the market mechanism. So in that sense, this mechanism, in order for this mechanism to work efficiently and continuously, it should create some mechanism or tendencies that keep out all outside interventions or disturbances or any kind of idiosyncrasies among individuals or classes or social sections, etc. The second rule is, as each piece or element will also affect the harmonization of other pieces or other elements by adapting local changes, invisible hands should contain an equilibrating mechanism which ensures the generation of the specific pattern as a consequence of all these harmonizations. You know, there may be some, again, abnormal cases, abnormal influences, again, idiosyncrasies, existence of class relations, etc. Remember, Marx sees history as a kind of, as a continuous case of class struggle, and whenever class struggle is becoming stronger, then there may be or may not be, of course, a revolution and so forth, so the whole mechanism will collapse, etc. But in order for the invisible hand to work, maintain itself, and reproduce itself, these kind of disturbances must not exist, or at least they should be kept in certain limits so as to make the mechanism work in general. So on the basis of these two rules or mechanisms, we can say that the invisible hand will ensure optimal resource allocation, in the sense of resource allocation, behavior of the system, and unintended and unpredicted manner. This idea may be interpreted in two ways. One interpretation is this famous Hegelian idea of the cunning of reason. You know, Hegel believes that there's no such thing as freedom of choice. Each one of us actually fulfills some cosmological function, cosmological role, which is nothing but the self-realization of the spirit or Geist thing, etc. Everything occurs in history must occur by necessity. There's no such thing as randomness or luck in the occurrence of things or in history. History moves towards a specific end, which is the self-realization of self-consciousness of the Geist or the spirit itself. So everything that is occurring in history will occur behind the backs of individuals, so to speak. In other words, individuals are nothing but puppets, in other words, which has no control or no effect upon the change in history or the course of history in general. This is the idea of cunning of reason. It's a kind of cunning, it's a self-deception for our own part, because we think ourselves as having some kind of free will. We have the freedom of choice and so forth, but this is just an illusion. It's a cunning of reason. It's a form of self-deception. There's no such thing. This is one type of interpretation of the invisible hand. Usually in economics, we can see this kind of attitude. No matter what individuals do, invisible hand will emerge, and also it will reproduce itself smoothly, so to speak. So without any kind of intentional action, etc., etc. And also there's a weaker interpretation of this idea. Again, this process is more or less automatic or autonomous, but still individual action is necessary for this whole mechanism to be created and for the reproduction. The difference between these two interpretations is not great actually in this case, because in both of them we have the idea of automatic creation of the system and also automatic functioning of the system. So individuals are considered as powerless in this case. They have no power of changing or affecting the system. Only the government, maybe, or the state as in general, have the power to disrupt it, which is not good because it will destroy the whole mechanism, which will create some suboptimalities and inefficiencies, waste of resources, problems in the allocation of resources, etc., etc. So still in both of these explanations, we have a kind of, again, Panglossian idea. And from our discussion of evolutionary notions, also we mentioned the criticism by biologists, Levontin and Gould, of this understanding of functionalist and optimal thing, the Spenders of San Marco and so forth. So again, this is the same idea we encounter with. This world is the best of all possible worlds. No matter what happens in the world, this is always the best. Invisible hand, in other words, will always create the most efficient results, the best results. It's always optimal, in other words. Another example, this is maybe even more interesting example, is the Hayek's interpretation of the idea of invisible hand. And his idea is called spontaneous order. Again, we have 10 minutes. And maybe in 5 minutes we can talk about Hayek and then stop. Hayek actually, or the Austrian tradition in general, opposes formal general equilibrium models, that of walruses, for example. And in his spontaneous order approach, Hayek basically emphasized that competition is a dynamic process, which also involves change, also even evolution. So the point is that invisible hand emerges even in such a dynamic environment. Here, the conception maybe later, Hayek connected this idea to the notion of evolution. This emergence of the spontaneous order is a result, of course, unintended result, outcome of a long history of change or evolution in general. And even the reproduction follows an evolutionary path, we can say. So the need for perceiving the operation of the market, thus competition as a process, is an integral part of Hayek's theory. This is very important because in Walrasian general equilibrium or other interpretations of the neoclassical formal equilibrium models, there's no such thing as time or change. The production, for example, does not take any kind of time, and competition occurs instantly. Remember our understanding of equilibrium, partial equilibrium, we have demand and supply. So when the two are equal, there will be equilibrium, but if the price is above the equilibrium price, there will be a change, price must change. But this occurs instantaneously. It doesn't take any kind of time. But Austrians, on the other hand, this occurs in the calendar time even. So competition is a process rather than a state. So this is very interesting and important. Such an understanding of competition can be found also in Adam Smith. Hayek argues that too, actually, and also interestingly in Marx. And of course, Schumpeter was and is also considered as a member of the Austrian school. Kind of awkward member, but still a member. So an equilibrium situation refers to one in which individual plans are fully coordinated. So the consistency of optimal plans. The spontaneous order created by the market owes its existence primarily to the function of prices in conveying knowledge. So last time we discussed, I remember, the basic function of the prices is to reflect the information of relative scarcities. Whenever there's a high price in the market, it means that the resource in question is relatively more scarce than others, etc., etc. So basic function of the whole price mechanism in general is to collect, process and disseminate the piecemeal information at the hands of individuals. And this working of the order is spontaneous in the sense that it is not dependent on the individual's plans or their predictions or their ideas, but they emerge as a kind of unintended consequences. Maybe we can stop here and continue next week, I guess. And next week we can go into some detail about this kind of understanding.